Good morning, friends. Now, as the week goes on, I want to get into more of the main points of Sunday's sermon, but I mentioned one thing sort of in passing in the message on Sunday that I really want to clarify, because in talking about God being the only one who can fix our problems, we of course focused in the message on our one ultimate problem, the problem of sin. That is our ultimate problem. And it's certainly one we have no power to fix ourselves, because we are sinful people. We are born in sin. We are sinful by nature as well as by action. And God, being a holy and just God, must punish sin. And that leaves us in a bad spot. That leaves us in need of rescue. We need to be rescued from the just wrath of God against that sin, our sin. And Jesus is the only one who can do that, who can provide that rescue, who can save us from God's right and proper wrath against our sin, which he did by taking that wrath on himself for all who believe in him and rely upon him for that salvation. But of course, we do understand, as occurred on that mountain all those years ago, that other problems, admittedly lesser problems, do arise as well. And sometimes, in the moment at least, those lesser problems don't feel lesser. The most obvious scenario is when you're desperately looking for physical healing. You've lived with chronic pain for so long. When you're suffering under a disability or a disease or a condition like cancer, fibromyalgia, multiple sclerosis, or any number of other things that can be constant sources of pain or weakness, things that make you face your own mortality, that bring anxiety and fear. Or perhaps to be a little bit different, it's financial problems. You don't know how you're going to pay your bills, how you're going to provide for your children. Sometimes it's that incredible frustration and stress of needing to get your car fixed, but you don't have the money to get your car fixed. But without your car, you can't go to your job, and if you can't go to your job, you can't make money, and so everything just spirals. Or, of course, emotional trauma. Perhaps you have the strife and division and perhaps even outright hostility within a fractured family. All you want is for your family to love each other and to be together, but there's nothing but anger and resentment. And sometimes these are the problems, real problems to be sure, that can nevertheless cloud a person's mind, that can dominate their priorities, such as they are not willing to see or consider that actual ultimate problem of sin that still looms over everything. And so the question I want to pose today is concerning those lesser problems that are nevertheless still real problems that cause that distress and anxiety and pain. And the question is this: as Christians trying to share the gospel with the people who have these kind of problems, how do we point them past those problems to that even greater problem of sin and the fact that the wages of sin is death? I mean, how can we pile that message on to someone who's already hurting so much? Don't we have to deal with the earthly problem first, get them to a place where that earthly problem doesn't so much dominate their mind, then they consider that greater problem? Well, there is certainly some truth to that, to a degree. As James said, how can we say to a person who lacks the physical necessities of life, how can we say to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body? So there is absolutely a sense in which we do need to minister to the whole person, to their physical, and may I dare add, mental and emotional needs, earthly though they may be, as well as to the ultimate need for reconciliation to God. But as we do that, we need to be incredibly careful. And again, as I said, don't shift too far the other way. I am not saying that we shouldn't try to address those earthly problems, because we absolutely should. But we have to be careful about the solutions we put forward, especially when we're trying to present the gospel message as well. Because again, while we can and should do whatever possible as God grants us ability to alleviate their physical suffering, doing so as an expression of God's love towards suffering people, even as we do that, we cannot promise them that if they come to Jesus, then he will heal them. And suddenly, by virtue of coming to Jesus, they will be healthy and wealthy and their lives will be fixed on this earth just simply because of that. Because obviously there are many people looking for salvation from those things, from their physical pain, or because their marriage is in trouble, or because they or a loved one has a drug addiction and they want Jesus to help them or that person to kick that habit or whatever. And if we promise them that if they come to Jesus, then Jesus will take care of all those things, then they might come to Jesus. But when they come to Jesus, when they accept Jesus for these reasons, they're simply putting their faith in Jesus to heal their physical bodies or to give them whatever that thing is. And that means they're not actually saved from the ultimate problem of sin. Now, hearing that, you might say, well, wait, weren't the people on the mountain that we talked about from Matthew 15, weren't they putting their faith in Jesus to be healed and he healed them? Isn't that the point? Doesn't that mean that we're saved? Well, not necessarily, because as we've learned, Jesus' healing ministry pointed to his saving work, but it was not his saving work. It was his healing ministry was not the same thing as his saving ministry, because being physically healed by Jesus did not save you eternally. Remember, we can safely conclude from all of the Gospels, from all of the passages that say that Jesus went to an area and he just healed everybody who came to him. We can safely conclude that Jesus healed thousands of people throughout his earthly ministry. And yet, between Christ's ascension and the day of Pentecost, after his obviously death and resurrection, we're told that there were only 120 believers gathered together there in Jerusalem. Now, later on in his letter to Corinthians, Paul tells us that Jesus also appeared to a group of some 500 brothers. Excuse me, though we're not given any details as to when or where or who exactly these 500 plus believers were. But even then, 500 and add 120, 620 or, whatever the number might have been, even that's nothing compared to the thousands that he healed, not to mention the many more thousands beyond that who had witnessed those healings. And so it is incredibly plausible, and this is not a happy thought. I'm not glad to be able to say this, but it's entirely plausible that there are people in hell right now who in their earthly life had literally been healed by Jesus, but they never put their faith in him for their ultimate problem of sin. And so they were not eternally saved. And so we have to be very careful that we don't confuse these two things, because looking to Jesus and relying on him, having faith in him merely in the sense of wanting him to heal our physical body or to take care of whatever other earthly problem we have, if that's all the further the faith goes, that's not a saving faith. That's not actually relying on Jesus to reconcile us to God the Father. That is simply trying to use Jesus or to get Jesus to fix a temporal problem we have now. So as we share the gospel with a loved one, particularly one who is desperately looking for physical healing or to have whatever other earthly problem solved, we need to be careful that we don't put forth a gospel message that is centered on their desire to be healed rather than on the recognition of their sinful state before God and that they need to be saved from that situation first and foremost. Now, before we conclude, let me clarify one more point, one more aspect of this. This does not mean that God does not care about the suffering of his people. We shouldn't view this from the perspective that God will save a person's soul, but then not actually care about them enough to do anything about their suffering on this earth, because that's simply not true. Because what is true is that God is able to heal people. He is able to fix these earthly problems, and to bring people to a place of honest joy and whole healing. But the truth that we need to embrace here is that healing routinely looks quite different from the kind of healing people often are looking for by default. Because there obviously are times when God literally heals a person of their physical pain or whatever kind of condition or whatever, again, the other problem. But far more often, and I believe actually far more glorifying to God in many ways, is when God does allow a person to continue in that physical hardship, but he brings healing to their heart and mind by changing their perspective to understand what ultimate salvation is really all about. and in having our hearts and minds changed, being then able to embrace the incredible mercy of God in making a way for us to be saved from the eternal consequences of sin, he enables us to have that entirely different perspective on the pain of this earthly life, most pertinently that it is temporary and that it is nothing compared to the glory that awaits us. As the Apostle Paul writes in Romans 8, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. And honestly, that's not something an unbeliever is going to understand, and they're certainly not going to accept it. But that's okay. We wouldn't expect them to understand it or accept it because it's one of God's truths. But for those whom God has regenerated, he brings them throughout their Christian lives in his power of sanctification. He brings them to an ever-increasing understanding of just how true and just how comforting that truth actually is. Whatever the pain is that we experience in this life, it is temporary. And in light of eternity, it is as nothing in comparison. Now, I know I've mentioned this before, but I'll gladly do it again. The greatest example that I have personally experienced of this is a man named Justin Peters, who is a preacher and teacher of God's word who suffers from muscular dystrophy. He's crippled by his own admission. He'll use that word. He said, I'm crippled. He can't walk. He has to rely on a wheelchair or a scooter. And you can imagine the pain, both physical and emotional, that has caused him throughout his life on account of this. But he loves the Lord. He belongs to the Lord. He understands what I've been saying here this morning. And so he has said on a number of occasions that I've heard him that if God chooses not to heal him on this earth, then that's fine. Because even if he lives the rest of his life with his disability, he has the rest of eternity to live without it. And that is the kind of spiritual, mental, and emotional healing that is guaranteed when Christ saves his people. In the regenerating work of the Holy Spirit, he helps us to come to that understanding more and more so that we can have peace and joy, even if there still is physical pain or pain of whatever sort in our lives based on this earth. But then again, even as exemplified in Justin's statement, our complete physical healing and healing of every sort is guaranteed due to the redemption of Christ. Because one day our earthly bodies, our temporary, finite, mortal bodies will be transformed, will be glorified and made perfect. And on that day, the day of Christ's return, those who belong to him will be healed in every way, and we will never again know what pain or disease or heartache or death is evermore, ever again, forever. So yes, God can still heal people today, and he does still heal people today. But the promise we hold out in the gospel is not the physical healing that so many people are looking for. It's the solution to that greater problem of sin, in the knowledge that yes, for all who trust in him concerning that greater problem, all the other healing we could ever need or want will be provided in the fulfillment of our salvation in the kingdom yet to come. With that, friends, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I will see you soon.